So if you go all the way back to the early 90s, the position of the Democratic Party, which was still quote-unquote pro-choice, which is, of course, a euphemism, the original position was safe, legal, and rare. Right? You recall, Hillary Clinton said this back when she was First Lady of the United States. The way she articulated abortion was safe, legal, and rare. Here's what that sounded like.
We can support a woman's right to choose that makes abortion safe, legal, and rare, and reduces the number of abortions.
Okay, well, that happens to not be the position of the Democratic Party today. First of all, that was never logically tenable, right? If you want something to be safe and legal, then your suggestion is that there really isn't anything morally wrong with the act that's taking place. If abortion is not morally wrong, then why should it be rare? So if you want it to be safe and legal, then why exactly should it be rare? Obviously, once you say it should be rare, you're acknowledging that there is a moral wrong that is being done at some level. And therefore, the case for it being legal is actually a lot weaker, particularly when what you're talking about is not some sort of consensual behavior. You're talking about the taking of an unborn life. But the new position of the Democratic Party increasingly, and at least a lot of folks on the mainstream left, is not even safe, legal, and rare. They've moved beyond that. Now we are in the shout your abortion era. You have folks like Lena Dunham, who, I'll just leave it there. She says, literally, she said this in the last couple of years. She said that she wished she'd had an abortion. And this is what it sounded like.
Now I can say that I still haven't had an abortion, but I wish I had.
I mean, that's an amazing statement. It has become a rite of passage for people, a way of showing, of signaling to people that you are a good women's rights advocate, to suggest that you wish you had an abortion. I mean, imagine the moral evil that it takes to be able to say that you wished that you had conceived a child just to kill that baby in your womb so that then you could brag to all of your friends about what a good feminist you were. It's an amazing, incredible, disgusting thing. Okay, so this position has changed radically. Now, I don't want to take on the kind of straw man position that Democrats are all the most radical people on earth. I want to take on the most mainstream arguments that are made against the pro-life position. And we're going to go through these one by one. There are basically 10 of these pro-choice arguments. And all of them are meritless. All of them are meritless. So we're going to go through them, and then I hope by the end of the show that folks are going to be equipped to speak more honestly and truthfully about how these issues work. So, argument number one is that this isn't a human being, right? It's not a human life. This is the argument that was put out by the editor of some publication called Romper, which I'd never heard of. But earlier this week, this tweet was put up in which, we can show the tweet, in which this Romper editor suggested, "Dear SCOTUS, Supreme Court, fetal tissue is not a person, 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 but I am, and I matter more than fetal tissue." Signed, people who have miscarriages and abortions. So there are many, many logical problems with this position. Number one, to lump in people who have miscarriages with people who have abortions is in and of itself disgusting. Okay, there are many, many women who want their babies who had miscarriages. The idea that they didn't consider their own children because they had a miscarriage because it was just fetal tissue is just absolute garbage. It is absolute nonsense. This also happens to be ascientific. Now, if she had said that fetal stem cells are not the same as adult stem cells, of course that's true. But that's not what she's saying. She's saying fetal tissue, meaning the tissue of a fetus, is not a person. Okay, well, by that standard, human flesh is not a person. It's true. Being a person requires more than you just being a bag of flesh, right? You have to be alive, right? You have to be living. But there is no distinction whatsoever between the flesh of a baby 1 minute before it enters the vaginal canal and 1 minute after it exits the vaginal canal. The vaginal canal does not magically confer personhood. It's just sheer nonsense. And it's even more nonsensical when folks suggest that basically it's just a cluster of meaningless cells from the very beginning. Now, today's theme of the March for Life is that it is a march for science, right? Is that science is what matters. And this is why it's amazing. You see, the media will cover this march. There's a bunch of religious bigots out there trying to end women's rights. That's how if they cover it at all, right? There'll be hundreds of thousands of people who show up today, and there'll be like 9,000 people who show up tomorrow at the Women's March. And they'll cover the Women's March endlessly, and they will probably ignore, for the most part, the March for Life. But if they do cover it, they will fail to acknowledge that the actual rationale for the pro-life position is not religious in nature. We'll talk about religion in a bit. But it's not really religious in nature. The actual pro-life position is based on the sheer, unadulterated science of human life. So let's go through that science for a second. So let's begin with week one, right? Week one of pregnancy, or at least this is at conception. Right? We have some graphics that we can put up here. If you take a look at what fertilization looks like, at the start of the week, ovulation happens. The egg is fertilized. And at that point, human life begins. There's no question that a human life has now begun. If you were to find this on another planet, it would be considered a life, right? You would say life found on Mars. If you found this organism on another planet, it would be a life. This is a human life. Now, the question as to whether it is a baby is an irrelevant one, because the bottom line is that this will become a full-grown human being if left unimpeded in the natural course of things. This has an independent DNA, okay? This is going to have an independent human existence. So you don't have to say that this is a baby. It's not a baby, obviously. It doesn't have to be a baby. It doesn't look like a baby, but it is a human life, and that's what matters. Okay, and then very quickly, there's implantation, that takes place, and then by 4 weeks, by the time most women recognize that they are even pregnant, the ball of cells that is supposedly not human life is now an embryo. Okay, this is, by this point, it's now an embryo, and by 5 weeks, the baby is already beginning its own, to form its own circulatory system. The tiny heart already begins to beat at about week 5. By week 6, right, we are now talking 1 month of a woman knowing she's pregnant. By week 6, the nose, mouth, and ears are starting to take shape. The intestines and brains are beginning to develop. Okay, by week 7, the baby has doubled in size since the last week. Little hands and feet are beginning to emerge. By 8 weeks, breathing tubes are extending from the throat to the developing lungs. Nerve cells are branching out, forming those primitive neural pathways. Right, this is when people start to make the arguments about whether babies can feel pain or not. At 9 weeks, the baby's basic physiology is in place. Okay, the baby continues to gain weight. By week 10, the skin is translucent, but tiny limbs can bend. Details like fingernails are beginning to form. We can tell the sex of the baby at this point. Right? This is when most women go into the doctor, and the doctor does the ultrasound, and then you can tell whether the baby is a boy or a girl. Okay, all of this is happening within the first 2.5 months of pregnancy. Okay, all of this is happening within the first trimester. And yet the Democratic Party platform position is that this is not a full-grown, it doesn't matter at all. Right? There's no moral component of aborting anything, anywhere in here. And all the way up to birth, there is no moral component. That's an incredible science-free argument. And yet that is the argument that's made. And we are called the science deniers if we dare to mention things like biology, basic fetal biology. You know who actually acknowledged that that abortion was taking a human life? It was actually the founder of Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger said abortion was the wrong way. No matter how early it was performed, it was taking life. It was only later that Planned Parenthood became not a contraceptive center, but an abortion center. Alrighty, so the second argument with regard to the pro-choice position is that this baby can't survive on its own, right? We should be able to abort it because, after all, it's hooked up to another human. And because it's hooked up to another human, viability is the real test. Peter Singer, who's an ethicist at Princeton University, which tells you everything you really need to know about Princeton University, he acknowledges that this makes no sense. Really, he acknowledges that it makes no sense because most babies are not viable in the sense that they can survive on their own for several years after they are born. I have a 2.5-year-old son right now. He cannot survive on his own, legitimately. Like, if both my wife and I were to abandon him in the house, he would stick a fork into an electric socket within minutes. Right? This is what small children do, and this is particularly true of infants. Right? If you have an infant, the infant requires constant care. The infant constantly requires that you are feeding it and taking care of it and changing it. The viability argument makes no sense. It doesn't even make sense when you're talking about many older Americans who require constant care in places like assisted living facilities. So the viability argument that if you are dependent on another human being to help you live, you are therefore not a human life, obviously doesn't hold, which is why Peter Singer, he actually acknowledges this. He says, opponents will respond that abortion is, by its very nature, unsafe for the fetus. They point out that abortion kills a unique living human individual. That claim is difficult to deny because, again, this is a separate human being. So what he says is that killing a newborn is not equivalent to killing a person because what you really need, the standard should be self-consciousness or autonomy or rationality, but none of those hold up to scrutiny. None of those hold up to scrutiny. Now, the reason none of those hold up to scrutiny as a standard for viability, autonomy, self-consciousness, rationality, is that, again, babies do not have any of these things. Okay, so if that's the case, then you should be able to commit infanticide. And in fact, that's actually what Peter Singer says. He says you should be able to commit infanticide on kids after they're born. At least if the pro-choice position were to be consistent, they would have to acknowledge how evil that position is, full scale.